Hello, and welcome to this week's Retroactive Podcast. As usual, I'm going to just hit a few personal notes before getting started. Today is the anniversary of September 11th, so I feel it would be inappropriate to harp on the more comedic elements of things going on in the world on this particular day. So I'm not going to do that today. We'll save those for next week. They're always going to be there, let's face it. I am going to very quickly just hit my thoughts on the debate last night, just because it is so important and it's not a trivial matter, but I'm going to try to hit it really fast because, to be honest, I don't want to focus on that today. So Kamala Harris and Donald Trump had the presidential debate last night. If I'm being honest, I pretty much wanted to turn it off about 20 minutes into it. It was more annoying than anything else from both of them. Those people that are already fans of Donald Trump, of which I am not one, think he did a fantastic job, and I'm sorry, you're wrong, he lost. Those who think Kamala did a fantastic job, I'm sorry, but she did better than I expected her to do, but my expectations really couldn't get any lower. So she was more effective at deflecting than I thought she would be able to be. But once again, she didn't really win. She just lost less than Donald Trump did. And the people that were already on Trump's side are still on Trump's side. The people that were already on Kamala's side are still on Kamala's side. Did she convince anybody that was in the middle, that was kind of like, I don't really know about either of these people, I'm kind of open to either? Did she compel them to come over to her side? No. So that's why I say she didn't really win. She just lost slightly less than he did. Honestly, I found the entire thing grating. So I'm just going to be completely honest about that. And the main reason I bring it up is because of the media, the way it was run. It was openly antagonistic. As you know, I've complained about the media absolutely ruining their credibility with centralists, with people that are unbiased. They're not on Team Red or Team Blue. They just would like the facts and to be given the credit that they have enough functioning neurons in their brains that they can arrive at your own conclusions, their own conclusions, without you telling them what they need to think about a story. And the more the media tells you what to think, the more credibility they lose, because it's obvious whose side they're on. And that was never more apparent than last night. They were openly hostile. They fact-checked Donald Trump in the middle of the debate multiple times, which is good. They should do that. I'm not going to be one of these people that are like diehard MAGAs of, no, you should just take everything he says at face value. He does need to be fact-checked. But then they didn't do the same thing to Kamala, which is why I feel like it's my job to point it out. If they're not going to point out her lies, then I do feel like it's my job. Trump's lies were pointed out. In a couple of cases, they said things that he said were lies, called it fact-checking, when in fact they're in the wrong on that. So I'm going to fact-check them. For example, they said that there are no states where babies that have been born are allowed to be killed, relating to the abortion issue. They fact-checked him on that. That was a clever wording, because if by killed, do you mean a doctor can go over and decapitate a baby? No, of course they can't. But that's not what anyone was suggesting they could do in the first place. There has been multiple attempts to create something called a Born Alive Infant Protection Act, which means if a baby is born alive during an abortion. The abortion is botched, and all of a sudden, oh crap, you've got a live baby here, and it's been born. The Born Alive Infant Protection Act means that the doctor can be held liable if he doesn't try to save that baby. That baby is alive now. You can't just let it die. And there are several states, Minnesota included. This act came before Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's running mate, and he refused to pass it. He said, no, if a baby is born alive during an abortion, a doctor should be able to lay it on the table and allow it to slowly die, which is why when the media fact-checked Trump, they said, you can't kill the baby. Well, if by kill, does that mean you can actively go over there and increase the harm to it? No, you can't do that. But actually 8 babies have died in Minnesota alone, just in Tim Walz's state, from this very thing. They were late-term abortions. Baby was born alive. The doctor set them aside and allowed them to slowly die, giving them no aid, and 8 babies died that way, just in his state alone. He refused to pass an act saying doctors that do that can be held liable, that at that point the baby's been born, this is no longer an abortion, you can't just let a baby die without trying to help it. So the media deliberately deceived the American public, so I'm fact-checking them there. Because if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. But mostly, they failed to fact-check Kamala. Now, like I said, the things they fact-checked Trump on, they should be fact-checking Trump on. I don't need to repeat them. If you watched the debate, you saw how they fact-checked Trump. So I'm going to do just the very brief fact-check of Kamala that they did not do, because it was very, very obvious whose side they were on. She said that Trump wants to create a national monitor of all women so that they can tell if they've had abortions or miscarriages. I don't know what sci-fi movie she's living in, but that's not even possible. There is no way that first of all, a miscarriage and an abortion are 2 entirely different things, and I'm tired of the dishonesty of people trying to pretend like they're the same. Like if you say you can't have an abortion 2 minutes before birth in the 9th month, that if you pass a law like that, that suddenly means that a woman who has a natural miscarriage is going to end up in jail. It's such an entirely dishonest argument. It's a stupid argument. You only are going to fall for that if you're pretty low IQ to begin with, and that's ludicrous. But even if it was the same thing, how in the world, what are the government going to do? Are they going to put implants into your body to know that you were pregnant and that your body miscarried a few minutes ago and then come round you up? What sci-fi movie are you living in? They didn't even fact check her on something as blatant as that. They said that the crime is down. Once again, here I'm fact checking the media. We all know that's not true. Crime is up everywhere. The stats show it, and the evidence of our own eyes shows it. So once again, I'm fact-checking the media there, because when Trump said that crime was down, they said, no, we're fact-checking you. The FBI says, when Trump said crime is up, they said, no, the FBI says crime is down. Not true. All the stats show crime is up, and the FBI did not include certain cities in their tally, which is the only way they can twist the stats to make it look like crime is down. But crime is up, and we all know that from our own eyes. I've been victims of crime for the first time in my life in the past year, so don't give me this. Kamala said that she has never, ever been taken the position that she wanted to ban fracking. Go watch the videos of her in 2019 when she was running for president. They asked her, are you for a ban on fracking? She said, without her usual evasive circular language, just out now, yes, I absolutely think we should ban fracking. So last night when she said, I've never been for banning fracking, they did not fact check her on that. There was no fact checks when she brought up Charlottesville. She said that Trump and Charlottesville, when there was, in case you're not part of this country, people wanting to tear down some Civil War statues because they related to the Confederacy. They didn't feel like anybody who fought for the Confederacy should be honored, irregardless of whatever their personal positions may have been on issues like slavery. Just if you fought for the Confederacy for any reason, your statues should be torn down, it should be erased from history, blah, blah, blah. Other people felt like, no, history's history. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to think slavery was a good thing. It obviously wasn't, but we don't tear down the monuments of people. History should be taught in its entirety. You shouldn't go around editing history. And there were also some out-and-out Nazi thugs, racist bigots, who jumped on the bandwagon and said, that's right, we love the people that wanted slavery, and we're for the bigotry, and we're for all of this. And Trump did say in Charlottesville over that protest that there were fine people on both sides of this argument. And in the very next breath, he said, discounting the Nazi bigots. So that has been debunked by every source out there, and yet she brought it up. That's one that the people sitting there know has been debunked because it's been debunked on their own network. So it's not like they just failed to know the stats on that one. They refused to fact check her about that. Also, when she said Donald Trump has threatened that there will be a bloodbath if he's not elected back into power, that is not true. I sat there and watched that speech. He said if he's not elected to power, it will be an economic bloodbath for the auto industry because too many of the jobs are being outsourced to other countries. There is no way you can listen to that in context and walk away with any other phrase. Once again, this is something that's been widely debunked. The media would not fact check her in the debate because it's clear that they're on her side, and to say, well, you're lying about that, Kamala, would make her look bad, and they can't risk her looking bad to people. But at the end of the day, all the Republicans out there today that are going, yeah, but it was an unfair debate. They're saying she won, but it wasn't fair. Facts don't care about your feelings. Were they unfair as moderators? Yeah. Did Trump do a bad job? Yes, he did. I'm sorry to break your little hearts, but he did not stay on task. He got distracted. He spouted off TikTok stories, which may be true or may not be true. It has yet to be proven either way, but they sound crazy. And so it was not wise of him to spout off crazy sounding stories as though they've already been proven. You need to have hard evidence before you do that. He got sidetracked into defending the numbers of people that come to his rallies, whether he throws good rallies or bad rallies, for the sake of his ego, instead of sticking to the meat and potatoes of the problem, which is she's been vice president for the past 3 years. She's failed at every single job she's been put in charge of, from the space program to the border to Ukraine, to her being the last person in the room on the Afghan withdrawal, to wanting to defund the police, all of these things. She's been in the wrong. She's changed her position in the last few weeks on every position she's publicly held that you can go back and watch videos of her saying, which you're allowed to do because you're allowed to evolve over time and go, hey, I was wrong about that, but not without an explanation, not without saying, well, this is why I now realize I was wrong. You can't just flip-flop. That's the difference between evolving and flip-flopping. If you're going to evolve, you have to explain, I didn't know this back then, and so this was what my position was based on. I now see otherwise. But if you just say, yes, I want to ban fracking, no, I don't want to ban fracking, and give no explanation, that's flip-flopping. He should have pointed these things out, and he should have said, every plan that she claims she's going to put in place, if you honestly believe that, why hasn't she put it in place in the past 3.5 years while she's been vice president? Why doesn't she put it in place right now? If she claims she can fix the economy, go do it. If she claims she can close the border, do it. Why are you letting more people flood over the border every day? He got distracted. He did not do a good job. I'm sorry that it hurts the right's feelings and those that think I'm playing for Team Right, but I've said from the beginning I'm centrist. I'm not playing for either team. Trump did not do a good job in the debate last night. It was his to lose, and he did lose it. Was it unfair? Yeah, fine, it was. Was the media not doing their job in some of their fact checks about him were lies, and they never once fact checked her? Yeah, But it doesn't matter whether it was unfair or not. The point is, people that were already on his side were still going to be on his side. People that were on her side are still going to be on her side. And the people in the middle got annoyed and walked away because the whole thing was ludicrous. So I don't think anybody was convinced at the end of the day. And that's reflected in a recent study that is talking about trust in the media. It basically shows that if people are on the same side as the media, whatever side that may be on, right or left, that if they're on the same side as the media and the media is saying what you want to hear, even if you know they're not being unbiased about it or even entirely honest, but they're saying it the way I like it said, then they say, yeah, the media is trustworthy. And if the media is saying the opposite of what you want to hear and you see the lies, then you're willing to point out the media is not trustworthy. This study showed that 20 years ago, only 13% of Democrats thought that the media was trustworthy because the media was more right-wing 20 years ago, and they felt like it was too biased to the right. Now, they are open propagandists for the left, and suddenly 73% of Democrats say the media is totally trustworthy. Most of the country doesn't agree with you on that, hon. I hate to break it to you, but you're not that good at what you're doing to make it seem like you're unbiased. You're not getting an Academy Award for your performance here. 36% of independents think the media is trustworthy. So 64% of them, 2/3 of the people in the middle, say the media is not being trustworthy. That's used to be 55%. So the independents 20 years ago were split about 50-50. Some of them thought the media is too right-wing. Some of them thought it was trustworthy. But now it's 2/3 say they're not trustworthy. And Republicans, 40% of them 20 years ago said that the media was trustworthy. So still, even when the media was more right-wing, 60% of Republicans didn't think it was trustworthy because Republicans by nature are more skeptical in personalities. You can look at certain personality traits and how they tend to guide you toward your political beliefs. And more skeptical, distrusting people tend to be conservative, and more accepting, kind of buy into whatever you tell me, people tend to be more liberal. So even when the media was more conservative 20 years ago, only 40% of Republicans trusted them. Now, less than 10% of Republicans do. So how much will this debate impact things? I guess we'll see in the remaining weeks. I don't think that anything has much of a impact in long-term memory. I think that the people that were on Trump's side are still on Trump's side. The people that were on Kamala's side are still on Kamala's side. The people in the middle, I don't think they were convinced by either side because both sides, frankly, did a bad job. And I think you're going to be left ultimately where you were. Nobody blew each other out of the water, and that's what was needed here, was a blowing out of the water. And we didn't get that. So for what it's worth, that's my take, and thank God we can move on now. So what I really want to add to this week's podcast is my memories of September 11th. We could do a moment of silence, we could do those sort of things, but that's a little bit strained in a podcast, and most people would just skip ahead anyway. So I feel like sharing my memories of that day would be a more fitting way for me personally to pay tribute. I was 17. I was getting ready for school. At the time, I was recovering from surgery, so I was doing school at home. So I did not have to be at school on a certain time. My brother had just arrived at work, and we got a phone call. The second plane had just hit the tower right before he arrived, which at the time was the only footage available. It was weeks later before footage emerged of the first plane hitting the tower. And he called and just said, turn on the news right now. And we did. And I remember sitting there. To say I was speechless is kind of an understatement. It was more like you were thoughtless. Your brain could not compute what you were seeing. And I sat and I watched this, horrified, wondering how are they going to help the people above the impact? Because those people were trapped above a fire. I sat and watched people jump. I heard that a plane had hit the Pentagon. At the time, they reported that the plane that had hit the Pentagon was a U.S. Airways plane, and that was the airline my biological father flew for, and he was out on a trip. So for a while, we didn't know if that was his plane. It wasn't until later that they realized it was United, and it was not. But even though I've never been close to my biological father, obviously you would not want him to be in that plane, so it was a stressful time. And then, of course, the plane went down in Pennsylvania. It was clearly linked, but it was becoming more and more evident that this was an attack. How many more of these planes are out there? They were getting President Bush into the Air Force One and into the air. They were grounding all the planes across the country. We had no idea what was going on. And I remember watching as they were zoomed in on the impact of one of the towers. They were zoomed in tight on the impact point, and you just saw everything begin to shake. And they zoomed out quickly, and those towers just fell out of the sky, taking all those lives with it. It was one of the most awful things I had ever seen, and I couldn't compute what I was seeing. I remembered later seeing clips from around the world. You know the places in the world I'm talking about. I don't need to specify you. You know the places I'm talking about, of people dancing and celebrating in the streets. And all I can say is, if that's your culture, it's an awful culture. That you would celebrate innocent civilians dying. I said the same thing about October 7th. If that's your religion, it's an awful religion. If that's your interpretation of a religion, that's an awful interpretation of a religion. If that's your morality, you have an awful morality. If that's your politics, you have awful politics. Insert your excuse here. But it was very revealing about the type of people who would celebrate something like that. I remembered watching a mother who was being interviewed by a news anchor on the corner who had a baby in her arms, duck down and cover her baby's head and flee from that huge cloud of debris and smoke with her baby as the person who had been interviewing her, called after her, be careful of your baby, because everybody's running. But I think the thing that I remember most, and it's interesting because it's something few other people remember, was kind of later when you're trying to wrap your head around all this, later as you're watching just that huge smoke cloud, and trying to wrap your mind around what's happened, all the lives lost, who's doing this, what more could be out there, what is this going to mean in terms of war, just so many things changing in the span of a morning. And I remember seeing a journalist with their cameraman walking into the cloud trying to get to ground zero. And you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead because they were in the middle of the debris cloud and it was so thick. And they ran into a police officer or firefighter. I believe it was a firefighter, but to be honest, I'm not 100% sure about that. But it was a civil servant in one form or the other. And he told them, get out of here. We are trying to do our jobs. We're trying to help. We need you out. Get out of here. And he was not inappropriate in any way. He was emotional, but he was not inappropriate. And the media, the journalists did not argue with him. They were like, okay, no problem. They were complying. Everybody was in such shock. And it was a different era, less confrontational. But he turned around before they left and he said, "Can you just tell me what all the beeping is?" And that's exactly what you had been wondering watching this. There were all these little beep, 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 hundreds of them coming from all directions. It wasn't sirens like ambulances. It was just beep, 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 beep. And they were everywhere. And you've been wondering, what is that? And this firefighter turned around with tears in his eyes. And he said, "Those are the body monitors of firefighters who have stopped moving." And they were everywhere. And that's when I realized how bad it was going to be. That this was not going to be like the Oklahoma City bombing. They were not going to be pulling people out. Everybody was dead. All these heroes who had gone to help people were dead. There were the heroic tales, of course, of the man who waited with his coworker who was in a wheelchair and couldn't be evacuated and was waiting with him in the tower till firefighters could get up there. Unfortunately, they both died in the tower when it collapsed. Nobody knew they were going to collapse. There was the man on the Pennsylvania flight who called his wife to say goodbye before heroically charging down the terrorists, knowing they would crash, but refusing to let the terrorists take innocent people with them. Saved a lot of lives in Washington, D.C. So many heroic stories from that day. And it shouldn't be forgotten. So, and, at the time I had to fly a lot of places to have the surgeries that I was needing at the time. Flew out to San Diego quite a bit. And, of course, air travel was a totally different experience before 9/11, all through my childhood, as it was after 9/11. Security was almost nothing. I mean, you walked through a metal detector. You kept your shoes on. You weren't patted down. You could do it in 2 minutes. You just would walk right up, walk through, throw your luggage onto the x-ray machine, walk through the metal detector, grab your luggage, and head on. I mean, that's all there was to it. There was none of the liquids, the shoes, the wanding down, the patting down, none of it. And it was a whole different world. And especially right after 9/11, the security was even more so than it is now, which is still incredibly more than it ever used to be, and should be. But the first time I had to fly out to San Diego for a surgery after 9/11, it was an experience because flying had changed. Everybody was kind of looking at other passengers warily. You didn't want to move wrong on that plane at first because everybody was on edge as far as if you gave any sort of indication that there was any reason to distrust you. People were not going to wait to find out that they were right about that. But I got out to San Diego, which is a big naval town. Those of you who don't live in the United States may not know. That's where Top Gun used to be, out at Miramar, out an island off of San Diego. And they still have a huge Navy presence there. They still have a huge Navy Air Force presence there, flying out over the desert. It's not called Top Gun anymore, and it's moved, but it's all still out there. It's an enormous Navy town. The original Top Gun was filmed out there. I know several of the places, the scenes in that movie. It's like, oh yeah, I know that house. Driven by that house. Oh, I know that bar. All these things. So it's always been that way. But when I flew out that first time, walking through the airport, which it's a massive airport, it was just flooded with sailors. in uniform. And they were being shipped out. So they were everywhere in the airport. This was a few months after 9/11, so the war had started, and they were being shipped out. And I had never seen this many military servicemen in one place, and they were everywhere. And the shock, because I always thought of people in the military as, well, these are grown-ups. I mean, these are men that are going out to defend the country. These are grown-ups. And for the first time, I was looking into the faces of kids, and I realized why they suddenly looked like kids to me. I was 17. These boys were 1 year older than I was. They were my age. And when you reach that age, you realize 18 ain't grown up. 18's a baby. But that was another thing that hit home, just how big the sacrifice that is made by those who, even at a young age, at an age where they've got their whole life ahead of them, every reason to be irresponsible, were signing up and doing their duty and going out there and defending their country. And we owe our veterans respect. You don't have to agree with every war to agree that the veterans who didn't get to decide what war they were fighting in, they signed up to defend their country. They did what they were ordered to do, and they served, and they protected your ass. They deserve our respect. Case closed. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You do not disrespect our military. Case closed. So anyway, those are my memories of 9/11. And I hope they brought to mind your own memories, because we should remember that day and all of its lessons, all of the people, all of its victims, the many children who were not yet born, who lost parents that day. There were many pregnancies, children born that did not know their father because of that day, or children that were too young to remember their father that are now grown and graduated high school, and, so it's important to stop and remember, and I wanted to do that today. So, to get to the retroactive podcast, this was one that I worked really hard on, did a lot of investigating into to collect the stats for, so I hope you find it interesting. Speaking the Hard Truths, Part 2, Fentanyl. And I do encourage you to go to Substack and pull up this article. Views of an Outsider is my account name, just like the podcast. You'll have to scroll back a little bit till you find Speaking the Hard Truths Part 2. But the images that I included in this are really something. So I encourage you to do that while you're listening. This series is devoted to the hard truths, to the things we don't know or don't want to know. Part 2 is focused on the fentanyl crisis. Fentanyl is a word we've all heard by now. And like me, you may have also heard that overdoses are on the rise. But if you're like me, you also may not be aware of how this drug war differs from the previous ones. I assumed that the victims were addicts, which is still tragic, but like typical overdoses, involved someone who knowingly took a dangerous drug, took too much, and died, having gambled with risky behavior and sadly lost. I don't say that with judgment, just with unemotional logic. I knew fentanyl was much more dangerous and much more lethal, but I assumed the overdoses came from the endless chase of the high. What I didn't know surprised me, and it may surprise you too. North America now has the highest rate of opioid use in the entire world. Fentanyl claims the life of another American every 5 minutes. In 1999, there were less than 20,000 overdose deaths. By 2021, there were more than 5 times that number, 107,000 deaths. Back in 2013, around 3,000 people died from fentanyl. In 2014, the next year, the stats shifted from opioids like heroin to fentanyl. The overdoses rose by over 6 times during the Obama years, and by 2016, when Trump took office, overdoses had risen to 19,413 from 3,000. That number more than doubled under Trump, reaching 56,516 by 2020. But under Biden, the numbers have skyrocketed at an even more unimaginable rate, reaching 73,654 just 2 years later in 2022, with overdose fatalities reaching well over 100,000. This is now the leading cause of death for adults between the age of 18 and 49. Fentanyl now kills more people than automobile accidents or gun-related deaths. At this rate, if the numbers suddenly plateaued and stop rising, which they show no signs of doing, there are 62,540 people alive right now, as in when this article was written, who will be dead by Election Day. And we will see 84,960 deaths between today, when the article was written, and Inauguration Day, when the next president takes power. Will one of those deaths be someone you love? To put this into context, that is almost 35 times the number of Americans who died on D-Day. And we are currently powerless to save them or their families. If we do nothing, another 511,825 people, over 500,000 of our loved ones, will be dead by the time the next president takes power in 2029. And that's if the numbers stay the same instead of continue to climb. So choose carefully this November, because that number will be more dead people than if we relived 9/11 more than 171 times. And that's if the rates don't increase over those years the way they've been increasing. Other than the numbers, what makes this drug crisis different from any of the ones we've lived through before? What is really going on in homes across America right now? How did we get here? And how do we get out of here? The first thing you have to understand is that these deaths are not just occurring to homeless people in big cities like San Francisco. Small towns have been decimated by this epidemic and left to rot. Camden, New Jersey is one such town. Here, fentanyl has even made its way into schools, with students overdosing on school buses. Schools have been forced to stock the overdose reversal drug Narcan and provide training in its use for bus drivers. There are multiple open-air drug markets in this small town and multiple rehabs nearby which supply drugs like methadone to addicts to help them wean off of harder drugs. Unfortunately, they often take the methadone and sell it in these same drug markets, merely compounding the problem. Kristen Riviera lost her brother to this drug crisis. He had struggled with an addiction to heroin for over 20 years, but had been doing well, until he fell off the wagon again and went to a market in Camden. He wound up ingesting fentanyl and died in 2018. His death saved 4 lives via organ donation. However, it's not only long-term hardcore addicts who are the victims in this drug war. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that was created in 1958 as an IV anesthetic used for extreme pain. It is 100 times stronger than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. A mere 2 milligrams is lethal. I have a picture of that next to a penny. It looks like a couple particles of dust. That's your lethal dosage. This is what makes it so easy to traffic, because it's incredibly strong, which means you can carry a very small amount and still be moving a lot of drugs. It is also cheap, going from $5 a pill to $3 a pill to as low as 40 cents per pill. Undercover police like Officer Schultz report attempting to buy 1,000 pills and being offered 20,000 for the same price. Fentanyl is easy to move, cheap, easy to buy, easy to ingest, and incredibly deadly. In 2019, China became the primary source of fentanyl, outstripping American drug companies regulated by the FDA. They traffic the deadly drug into the United States by mail and over our dangerously open southern border with Mexico. Investigative journalist and author Peter Schweitzer sheds some light on the connections between the financing, the politics, and the Chinese drug trade, which is escalating this epidemic. He uncovered how China is functioning as the senior partner that supplies the ingredients to the junior partner, the Mexican drug cartels. 90% of the precursor ingredients are trafficked into Mexico at the port of Montefiore. This terminal is run by a Chinese company who moves the ingredients to a border town in North Mexico, where 2,000 Chinese nationals help the Mexican cartels turn the ingredients into fentanyl. The Chinese provide the pill presses, which turn raw fentanyl into pill forms, which can then be transported. The pill molds disguise fentanyl as Adderall or Vicodin, which is often what people think they are taking. The cartels then use Chinese apps and communication devices to distribute fentanyl within the U.S., knowing that China will not share the information on these apps with law enforcement in the USA. Then the drug money is laundered through China's state-owned banks. The U.S. government reports that Chinese citizens inside the USA on student visas are used to do all this work on the inside. But if the government knows this is happening, why do they make no move to stop it? Brandon Judd of the Border Patrol explained how the cartels fly drones into U.S. airspace to spy on the Border Patrol's locations and then flood immigrants over an illegal entry point as a distraction. Since Border Patrol is not allowed to shoot down these drones without submitting a request up the chain of command and waiting hours for an answer to trickle back down, by which time the drone has done its job and disappeared, their hands are tied to stop this defiant tactic. And now that the Border Patrol has been transformed into a busing service for illegal immigrants by the current administration, when they drive away to pick up stranded illegals, Border Patrol is forced to leave sections of the border unpatrolled and wide open for the coordinating branches of the cartel to run fentanyl, cocaine, and meth into the United States. By the way, I'm going to insert here that the bill that the Democrats and especially Kamala Harris keep trying to tout right now, that was their border bill that Republicans shot down, that was because, yes, it was going to hire more Border Patrol agents, but it wasn't going to change the fact that they're not letting Border Patrol agents patrol the border. They're using them to bus immigrants around, which was why it was shot down by Republicans. It wasn't going to change anything except allow us to bring in even more illegal people. But it wasn't going to actually allow Border Patrol to do its job. The DEA says that 95% of the fentanyl on the streets of the U.S. is coming from Mexico. That was the number they gave, 95%. But because illegal immigration is sky high, with no moves being made by the White House to stem or responsibly regulate it, there is virtually no way to go after the cartels, despite knowing their strategies, which has resulted in a tidal wave of deadly drugs on our streets. Fentanyl seized at the border was up 480% in 2023 when compared to 2020, when Biden opened the border. 27,000 pounds of fentanyl were seized just in 2023, compared to the already immense 4,800 pounds seized in 2020. 4,800 pounds to 27,000 pounds. And that is not taking into account all the fentanyl that made it through. That's what they seized. Not counting what made it through to kill all the people that it's been killing. So the source is known, and the killing of Americans could be stopped as easily as turning off a spigot by simply closing the border. But nothing is being done, or has been for the past 3.5 years. Camden, New Jersey has been run by Democrats since 1936. It was a boomtown in the early 1900s, growing immensely in the 30s and 40s, employing tens of thousands in its manufacturing plants. In the 50s, there were 43,000 manufacturing jobs here, along with 124,000 people. By 1980, that number had dropped to 85,000 people, with just 10,000 jobs, down from 43,000. And today, only 70,000 people live there, from 124,000, nearly 250,000 people. What was once a nice place to live has become a wasteland hellscape. There are pictures of all of this. Hardly any businesses remain open, and people shoot up in public, in broad daylight, on the steps of former Jewish day schools, as women sell themselves, not in alleys, but in plain view. You can't drive even a block here without witnessing a crime being committed, which is why Camden has frequently been on the list of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the United States. Despite its small size, it currently ranks 14th in the nation for violent crime. 1 out of every 63 citizens are victimized every year. So, everybody's victimized eventually, and usually more than once. Yet Camden's Democratic mayor, Victor Kostarfin, declares Camden to be a shining example of democratic governance, which voters may want to keep in mind on Election Day. The effects of fentanyl, like morphine, recede quickly. So dealers have taken to cutting it with xylazine, aka Tranq. Tranq is a horse tranquilizer that extends the effects of fentanyl. The problem is that Tranq causes severe respiratory infections and leaves massive flesh-eating wounds susceptible to severe infections, which can lead to amputations. Tranq has been a scourge on Philadelphia for a while now, and in 2021, over a third of Philly's 1,276 overdose deaths involved Tranq. I do include pictures of the type of wounds this creates, so fair warning on that. I mean, it's something that needs to be seen to be believed, but I don't want you to stumble across these pictures unawares. If you leave Camden, New Jersey, and cross into Kensington, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philly, you will witness a whole new level of this epidemic. In 2022, Kensington had 1,413 fatal overdoses. 80% of these involved fentanyl. 34% involved Tranq. Fentanyl alone can be counteracted with Narcan if it's used quickly. However, this life-saving drug has zero effect on Tranq. Esther, a 59-year-old middle school lunch lady from New Jersey, spends her free days on the streets of Kensington looking for her granddaughter's mother, who has been missing for more than 3 years. She belongs to several Facebook groups where tens of thousands of people search for their missing loved ones lost on the streets of places like Kensington. Begun as a way to reunite with old school friends and stay in touch with grandma, who would have thought that enough people would fall victim to this crisis that this would become what Facebook is used for? Fentanyl has infiltrated every drug supply, including weed. So be careful. And recreational drug use of all kinds is at an end for anyone who is unwilling to risk death from a fentanyl overdose. The following pictures were taken just 8 days after police did a sweep of Kensington, arresting people and seizing over 11 pounds of fentanyl. Observe the non-existent dent this made in a real-life land of the walking dead. Kensington has become a nightmare in every sense of the word. It truly looks like a post-apocalyptic sci-fi movie resembling Mad Max. The scenes shown in these pictures of Kensington Avenue continue non-stop for between 1.5 to 2 miles. Note the stroller, presumably holding a child, and the wheelchair-bound amputees, along with those completely doubled over, unable to stand up straight from long-term use of drugs, which have left them unable to straighten their back. There is also the near constant sight of police cars and crime scene tape from new overdoses and murders. Police drive right by these sites of unmanageable lawlessness and mind-boggling devastation and carnage. Can't they do something? I only ask, would you risk your life or imprisonment if things go sideways to confront a dangerously high addict when you know with certainty that the corrupt DAs won't prosecute them and disastrous BLM bail reforms will ensure that they are released onto the same streets without bail required within hours? You're going to risk your life for that? When fentanyl was first granted FDA approval in 1968, it was only approved in combination with droperidol to minimize the risk of abuse and addiction. The FDA understood from the beginning the dangers of this drug and the dangers it posed to society in terms of creating addicts. Duragesic, essentially a fentanyl patch, became the most successful fentanyl product when it was released in the 1980s. It was followed in 1998 by a fentanyl lollipop created by Actic for use in its cancer patients. In 2005, the FDA began investigating Duragesic because of the rising number of deaths from overdoses. The investigation revealed that Actic was being widely prescribed off-label, with 80% of the users not even having cancer or ever having had cancer. Later, the FDA released a follow-up to their investigation's public health advisory stating that, quote, doctors were inappropriately prescribing the fentanyl patch and patients were using it incorrectly. Today's crisis is considered the fourth wave in America's current drug problem. The first wave was the prescription opioid crisis of the early 2000s. After the aggressive marketing of OxyContin, which downplayed its addictive potential, misleading users and leading to a surge in fatalities. The second wave saw the rise of heroin use in 2010, which peaked at around 2015. The ongoing third wave was the widespread popularization of fentanyl in hotspots in the U.S., starting in 2013. The fourth wave, which is also ongoing, began in 2015 when fentanyl began being sold as heroin and used in combination with stimulants like cocaine and meth, as production in Mexico increased when China became involved. With the potency of each drug varying drastically, the combinations lead to a rise year after year of fatal overdoses. The escalation spiked so rapidly that 2022 overdose deaths more than doubled those in 2019. In 3 years, they doubled, with fentanyl being responsible for 70% of those. The next year, in 2023, the DEA seized more than 78.4 million fentanyl-laced pills and nearly 12,000 pounds of fentanyl powder, equaling enough lethal doses to kill 388.8 million people. And that's just what they seized, not counting what was not seized and killed people on the streets. For context, that many people dying would be equal to killing 1 out of every 20 people on the planet. That's how much fentanyl they seized. Was enough to kill 1 out of every 20 people of the entire Earth's population. And that's only the amount they caught. Because it is so cheap, easy to carry, and potent, dealers have been adding fentanyl to Xanax, Adderall, Oxycontin, Percocet, and even pot. By adding fentanyl to their products, dealers give their customers a stronger high, ensuring they keep coming back, all without ever knowing that they've been dosed with something else. And with fentanyl's highly addictive qualities, dealers ensure that clients will return to cope with the withdrawals, even if they are no longer actively chasing the high. They're just trying to escape the pain of withdrawals. Charles Layman is a fellow at the conservative think tank Manhattan Institute, which focuses on domestic policy and urban affairs. He says that by allowing the cartels to distribute much more potent drugs, it makes it easier for people to take more than their bodies are used to. The fentanyl crisis captured the public's attention when a story went national about 26-year-old Julia Gramani, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, in October of 2022. She was one of 3 New Yorkers who bought cocaine from a delivery service, and died from the fentanyl that none of them knew they were ingesting. Her parents were driving to check up on her after she had been unresponsive on the family chat and failed to answer her phone. They received the news on their way to her home that she was dead and pulled over. They had no idea what could have killed their daughter. Julia's parents feel that she was murdered by her dealer, Billy Ortega, who sold her a batch of drugs that he told her was cocaine. He had tried to sell it to another dealer because he had received reports that it was too strong. He texted the other dealer, quote, "Give it to some girls and see what happens, LOL." Ortega still shows no remorse for deceiving his customers about what they were taking or for selling them a product that he knew was too strong. Yet, for remorselessly killing 3 people and permanently gutting the numerous members of their family, he received a sentence of just 30 years. A 27-year-old former drug dealer who worked the streets of San Francisco gave Douglas Murray the inside story on the dark web about how these drugs were making their way into the homes of Americans. He showed Douglas just how easy it was to buy fentanyl or any other illicit drug online with just a few clicks. The drugs are shipped in Nylar balloons, which prevents them from being detected by drug-sniffing dogs. Terry, a Chicago police officer who lost her daughter Sydney, is one of the rare few who have succeeded in getting a drug-induced homicide conviction for her daughter's killers. Many states have similar laws on the books that hold dealers accountable for a death caused by their product, but in most places they aren't being enforced by the DAs or judges. She had to fight for 16 months just to get the police to bring in the dealers that killed her daughter for questioning, to try to elicit a confession. They both admitted to poisoning her daughter with a lethal dose of MDMA or ecstasy. They were charged, but released on bail. And while out on bond, they did it again. They were eventually convicted of Sydney's homicide in 2018, but there were 1,308 other drug poisonings in Chicago in 2023 without a single homicide conviction. Young JJ was only 19 when he died of fentanyl poisoning. He had never been a troublemaker, but he was young and curious and decided to experiment with cocaine one night. Or what he thought was cocaine. He unknowingly consumed a megadose of fentanyl, enough to kill 30 adults. He died right there in his bedroom, inside his family home in New Jersey, 30 minutes from Camden. His mother was at a restaurant nearby when she got the call that her son was dead. There is truly no such thing as recreational drug use anymore. This is happening to kids who aren't even teenagers yet, who don't know any better than to try something that they think will be fun or daring and looks as harmless as a pill. These school-aged kids wanting an Adderall believe that a prescription drug is safe, no matter where it's procured. And Adderall is a prescription drug. They are often unknowingly ingesting fentanyl. This is putting kids on a fast track to addiction and death. 13-year-olds have died believing that they were taking a Percocet. And now that some marijuana is also being laced with fentanyl, deaths among young people who think that weed is harmless are set to skyrocket. The 19-year-old son of YouTube's former CEO also fell victim to a fatal fentanyl overdose, as have countless families from the inner cities to suburbia, from the homeless of Kensington to the uber-wealthy of Silicon Valley. Patricia Drews lost her daughter to fentanyl as well. She now leads a group that seeks to raise awareness about what is happening and to help families who have suffered the same tragedy that she has. She advocates for the use of terms like poisoning and drug-induced homicide, since the word overdose carries with it the idea of an addict who knew what they were ingesting and chose to take the risk. Whereas many fentanyl victims, some addicts and some not, are not choosing to take fentanyl of their own free will. She advocates for these changes to the terminology used to describe fentanyl victims who have been tricked, so that dealers who deliberately poison their customers with fentanyl without their knowledge can be prosecuted for homicide. Patricia's daughter was drugged and raped at a party after moving to North Carolina when she was 18. She was traumatized not only by the experience, but by her experience at the hospital, where she was treated as though this was a consequence of her actions and therefore her fault. She asked her mother, quote, "If they treat me like this now, how do you think they'll treat me when we go to court?" In this young woman's case, silence proved deadly. To cope with what had happened to her, she began experimenting with pills and then moved on to harder drugs, telling her mom that sometimes it was easier to stay high so she didn't have to think about what had happened to her. April Babcock also turned personal tragedy into a voice for others. Her son Austin died of fentanyl in 2019 at only 25. She tries to support families, educate the public, and push for ways to stop these poisonings. She describes her son as a good kid, laid back, who loved soccer, and started dabbling with drugs when he was 19. She stresses that unlike the addicts you might picture who have decades to get clean and turn things around, her son didn't live long enough to make it to his first rehab. She grieves for the harsh reality that her boy didn't get the chance to learn from his mistakes, dying before he could grasp the danger of his choices. I would remind everyone that at 19, the part of your brain that's able to assess risks is not fully formed yet and won't be till 26. April grew close to Virginia Krager, mother of an American Idol semifinalist Tiffany Robertson, who died in 2015 after a friend gave her a pill that she thought was Percocet to help with her back pain. The pill contained fentanyl. Tiffany was just 26 and left behind 2 children. Her story is similar to Rachel Carlisle's. She lost her 27-year-old daughter Mariah in 2020. Mariah was a mother of 3 who thought she was borrowing a Xanax from a friend, not knowing about the deadly risk of fentanyl poisoning. That her friend had gotten the Xanax on the street and it had been laced. Her mother launched a billboard campaign after her death to warn the community that this was happening and that it wasn't just killing addicts on the street corner, it could happen to them. Just to drive the point home for some younger people, that means when you, quote, borrow a prescription medication from your friend, you're assuming they got that prescription at a pharmacy. They might have gotten it on the street, and if they did, there's a very good chance that pill is laced with fentanyl. So, just like recreational drug use is at an end, if you don't want to risk dying of fentanyl, borrowing prescription medications is too. Her daughter, Mariah, was raped in junior high, but didn't ever tell her. Her mom was aware of a change in her daughter, but not its cause. So she took her daughter to a doctor who prescribed her some antidepressants, and things seemed to get better. She was accepted into art school, but chose not to attend because she'd fallen in love. She had 3 babies, struggling with postpartum depression, and her mother was not aware that she was also in an abusive relationship. The next thing she knew, she received a phone call in the middle of the night that her daughter was dead, with no warning. Because of a family history of addiction, Mariah had been determined not to go down that path. But she thought that drugs prescribed all the time by doctors, like Xanax, were perfectly safe to take from a friend. More a silly rule than a risk. These mothers say they feel that the president was supposed to prioritize protecting them. They feel that by turning the border over to the cartels, he has, quote, punched them in the face. Now, with all the children dying, they want the border closed. They met with Senator Todd Young's office, as well as speaking to the Republican committee, bringing with them a box of obituaries from the families of victims from all across the country. They gave this representation of their suffering and loss happening among the American people to the congressmen who followed through on their promise to request a meeting with President Biden so they could deliver these tokens. President Biden has refused to accept the meeting or the obituaries. The first year of Biden's presidency, he submitted to Congress his drug policy priorities. Priority number 2 was, quote, advancing racial equity in our approach to drug policy. That was number 2. Equity is not the same as equality. In case you're unaware of this, equality is about providing equal opportunity. In this context, it would mean that a drug dealer from a minority group would receive the same sentence as a white drug dealer for dealing the same types and amounts of drugs. Equity means making adjustments in order to achieve an equality in the outcome. So, if you treat everyone the same for the same offense, regardless of their race, and this happens to result in a disproportionate number of racial minorities going to jail, even if this is directly linked to a disproportionate percentage of their population actually dealing drugs, this is somehow unfair, because the resulting numbers of the white people in jail versus the numbers of minorities in jail are not equal. Personally, I don't really care about the color of the skin of the person in jail. I care about, are they guilty of the crime? If they are, that's all I need to know. All I need to know. This policy shifted the priority from putting all guilty offenders in jail, thus protecting society, to a focus on letting some harmful offenders go free in order to make the numbers come out fair. And that was Biden's number 2 priority in the drug war. To this end, as listed in his own policy. To this end, in 2023, Biden announced a widespread pardon for all marijuana possession convictions, calling on all state governors to follow his lead. However, most people serving time for quote-unquote possession were originally charged with dealing and pled down to possession charges. This means that those serving prison terms for drugs are not some individual who was caught with a couple of joints in their dorm room. These are dealers and traffickers with amounts in their supply and the intent to distribute. The list of charges for those whom the president pardoned or whose sentences he commuted include, quote, conspiracy to distribute methamphetamines. This was originally carried a sentence of 20 years with parole, and conspiracy to distribute more than 5 kilograms of a mixture and substance containing cocaine and more than 50 grams of a mixture and substance containing cocaine base, which was originally sentenced to life with parole, etc. These are the kind of people he pardoned. Dealers are back on the streets right now in the middle of the worst drug crisis we have ever seen because of Biden's personal pardon. Can we honestly say that he is prioritizing the best interests of Americans who are contributing to society ahead of the best interest of drug dealers? Or is he standing by his priority to make the numbers look good, even when it means releasing dealers back onto the streets, which is killing our kids, including a lot of minority children? It's the epitome of Thomas Sowell's quote that we've exchanged doing what works for doing what sounds good. And we need to go back to doing what works. Sarah Laurel, a former addict, is the executive director of Savage Sisters in Philadelphia. Because Philly is one of the first places where trank caught on, it is a place where the epidemic has been going on the longest, and where we can see the future for America if action is not taken. Savage Sisters offers housing, street outreach, and training for other programs in the country, as well as showers and wound care for homeless people with substance abuse issues. But the problem is far beyond what Savage Sisters can effectively help. Many addicts can be found using again within hours after having their wounds cleaned. Conservatives in the city criticized the policies of Democrats as being well-intentioned ideas from people looking for creative ways to help drug addicts, but whose policies have only made the problem much worse by the numbers. They argue that the verdict is in and it's time to adjust course. Ideas like safe injection sites have not worked as hoped. These policies are based on conceding the war on drugs as unwinnable and refocusing priorities to giving addicts a safe place to do their drugs, where they can be kept alive if things go wrong. This is the best solution available, they believe, since nothing will decrease drug usage in their mind. But conservatives are frustrated with the failure of these programs to accomplish their own stated goals, preventing deaths. They call for a return to enforcing the laws as a deterrent to people who have not yet experimented, who might become new addicts, and to protect the innocent residents of these neighborhoods from drug-related crime. They protest that these law-abiding citizens have lost their rights and safety, and actually their entire neighborhoods, to this crisis. Innocent children are growing up in the middle of all this danger, thinking that this is all normal, and exposed to dangerous needles and addicts everywhere. They argue that abandoning the poorest and most vulnerable communities to total lawlessness is not compassion, but rather cruelty. They say compassion for the many must outweigh ineffective attempts at compassion for the few. But these policies still have their defenders despite their track record. These defenders fervently believe that recriminalizing drugs is unrealistically expensive with jails so full. They argue that there is no way to stop someone who's determined to use. They push for, quote, safe supply instead. The idea works like alcohol in a bar. They want places where addicts can go to purchase drugs that are safe and regulated and where the amounts are controlled, just like alcohol in a bar. You theoretically won't be overserved or given homemade moonshine that might make you go blind. Some cities have tried instituting overdose sites, safe injection sites, clean needle programs, decriminalization for small amounts of hard drugs, supplying harm reduction kits, making Narcan available over the counter, all but the last of which has only worsened the problem instead of improving it. That's by the numbers. And the death toll continues to rise. New York City is home to On Point, America's first officially authorized, supervised consumption site. Let me repeat that. It's America's first officially authorized, so it's sanctioned. You can do drugs there, sanctioned, while you're supervised consumption site. It provides 3 meals a day and clothing, along with a methadone program and supervised consumption. Although they do not supply drugs, you can bring your own drugs here and be given a kit that will allow you to test them and provide you with clean needles. Then, volunteers will watch over you after you shoot up, watching for signs of an overdose. The idea of harm reduction and safe supply has bipartisan support, although it remains controversial. But it clearly isn't working. It seems the more you try to offer quote-unquote safe ways to do drugs, the more people mistakenly believe that there actually is a safe way to do drugs. And the truth is, there isn't. Once someone experiments, they are on the road to potential addiction. And once someone is addicted, they don't always bother to go to the safe injection sites every time they want to get high. In fact, people can be seen doing drugs in the middle of the street just a few steps away from On Point, despite knowing about it and knowing what it is. You can ask them, what is that? And they will tell you. But they're not going in there to do their drugs. Studies and numbers from New South Wales, Spain, Norway, and all across Canada consistently show that while these sites do lower the frequency with which EMTs or ambulances are called, they don't lower any of the death tolls. Even when they prevent an overdose from proving fatal because they're watching you, because that person is still an addict, the stats show that eventually they will overdose somewhere else. It's not brought the death toll down at all. The reality that must be faced is that there is no way to safely consume dangerous, poisonous substances. The question is, are we willing to look at the data and adjust accordingly? Oregon has been forced to declare a fentanyl state of emergency in Portland after leading the charge to decriminalize drug possessions with Measure 110, which passed with 58% in 2020. Since then, they have been suffering the spikes in drug usage and all the snowball effects on life that followed. But Oregon, at least, has learned and has fought to repeal Measure 110, which would recriminalize drug usage there. The state of California, under the disastrous leadership of Gavin Newsom, and I would insert into the article here also Kamala Harris, because that was her state during this time, saw similar results after following suit. Advocates argue for continuing down this road despite its results, having a darkest before the dawn stubbornness. They argue that addicts should have the free will to do whatever they choose. does an addict have free will? They are perpetual slaves to ever harder drugs. Isn't that the meaning of addiction? That isn't living, and it shouldn't be promoted as a lifestyle choice. Having understanding for people shouldn't extend to enabling them. We have allowed this to happen, and many have had enough and are asking themselves if they still should. As these strategies fall short, there is hope. Cornell graduate, psychiatrist, and senior research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Sally Satel, advocates for mandatory treatment instead. She argues that this is the best solution for both the addicts and the communities. Mandated treatment offers addicts an alternative from being prosecuted for their violations, giving them the choice to either submit to treatment instead of going to jail. After that, the choice is theirs, while the communities are freed from this nightmare either way. Dr. Satel stresses the difference between criminalizing addiction versus holding people accountable for the crimes they commit as they pursue the maintenance of their drug habit. You can see the system in action in regions that use drug courts. Missing your drug court appointment can mean being rearrested or even expulsion from the program and prosecution for the crimes which you had been shown leniency for. Drug courts often involve more than a year of counseling, tests, and dealing with setbacks. Participants come to treatment every day in the beginning. When appropriate, they are offered methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone in order to cope with their addictions. Alan Justice, a former actor and opioid addict, is 7 months clean via one such program. Pursuing a route of understanding and help for addicts, while still stigmatizing rather than normalizing drug use as a lifestyle choice, just as we did with smoking, to deter new users, along with accountability and mandated treatment is, many are concluding, the only way forward. Since law and order must be maintained for the sake of innocent communities, we can offer humane alternatives to deal with those suffering from addiction while throwing the book at dealers and putting our foot down with Mexico and China. Some politicians pull their weight with this. Congressman Griffith from Virginia has been a major part of the efforts to combat the fentanyl crisis. His bill focuses on harsh penalties for dealers to deter them from the incentives. Easy money may not seem worth it if you're facing long years in prison and looking at a world in which those caught are aggressively prosecuted. Congressman Newhouse is co-sponsoring the bipartisan Save Americans from the Fentanyl Emergency Act, or SAFE Act. It would raise all fentanyl substances to Schedule 1 and advocates giving law enforcement everything they need to keep fentanyl off the streets. He is also trying to ensure that all fentanyl substances, whatever they may be mixed with, are covered by our laws, since the cartels are currently playing with holes in the system by changing the combinations of substances in order to avoid prosecution under loopholes. Leaders from both parties in multiple positions of power are urging Biden to classify fentanyl as a WMD, a weapon of mass destruction. That's how bad this is. Considering how small of an amount is required to be lethal, and how easy it is to kill so many people with it, they feel this classification is appropriate. Letters written by these coalitions were followed by a report stating that the DOD, FBI, and DHS have been preparing for a fentanyl weapon of mass destruction attack from as far back as 2018. Biden's so-called harm reduction policies have removed penalties for drug-related crimes in favor of policies like needle and syringe exchange programs, as seen in Kensington, where they actually hand out free crack pipes methadone, and test strips, none of which addresses the root of the problem. Once people are addicted, tragedy is almost inevitable. And the only way to stop them from becoming addicted in the first place is to stop the flood of fentanyl onto our streets. How do we do that? With serious penalties for drug dealing, especially those involving fentanyl. But most of all, by closing the border and by cracking down on China and Mexico, all of which Biden has refused to do. Congressman Mike Gallagher serves as chairman of the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. He holds the position that the U.S. should be taking a stronger stand when it comes to holding China accountable for the fentanyl epidemic. China has been producing the world's fentanyl for years. And for years, Biden has been satisfied with President Xi Jinping's promise to do something to stop it, which has remained a promise. So either we're supposed to believe that a communist dictator doesn't have any control over what goes on in his country, or we must believe that his failures to live up to those promises means that what is happening when it comes to poisoning Americans is what he wants. President Xi idolized his father, who poisoned his schoolteacher for not being radical enough when he was 14. So it is plausible that poisoning his enemies could be his chosen method for weakening the USA. If that is the case, why is Biden content with empty verbal promises being repeated and repeated, especially when time has already proven them to be false? Why is Biden depending on President Xi's promise in the first place? Why not take matters into our own hands and crack down on the money laundering via payment methods like WeChat Pay, which allows fentanyl profits to make their way back to China? We could sanction the port operators, the shipping companies that are being used, and most of all, secure our border, starting with a standing order to shoot down any drones in our airspace used to spy on Border Patrol. We could reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy while we verify people's identities and claims of asylum seekers and penalize all illegal entries with automatic deportation and being moved to the bottom of the list when it comes to reentry. We should also begin penalizing the Mexican president for his bad faith acts in refusing to accept deportees back, trying to claim that returning them constitutes an invasion of Mexico's border. Like, this guy seriously needs somebody tough with him. Also, for setting up a network in the U.S., which he has done, to try to persuade Americans of Mexican descent to vote for politicians based on what that politician's policies on USA-Mexico issues are, if they're harsh or cooperative with Mexico. But Biden has not so much as even verbally condemned the Mexican president's dismissal of his country's responsibility for bringing fentanyl into our country. Why is President Biden not taking the position with China that we can't carry on normal business relations with a country that is poisoning Americans en masse, killing more than 100,000 of us every year? Why is he not imposing restrictions on economic trade with China until something is done, not just promises, but action? Why is he not taking a stand with Mexico and closing the border? Why is he doing nothing to get fentanyl off the streets besides freeing more drug dealers? And why on earth is he not putting an end to Chinese citizens buying up American land around our military bases? America is not for sale. Foreign-owned businesses should not be able to own the land. The only people that should own land in the United States are American citizens, and that needs to be put into law. I was surprised to find out it isn't. It's not in China or Mexico's interest to stop the fentanyl crisis. Technically, it's in their interest for it to continue, but stopping it is in America's interest, so only we can stop it. We can only do that by laying out harsh penalties to China and Mexico for continuing down this path, and we absolutely cannot bluff, as Biden has developed a reputation for doing. How many times have we heard that man say, don't, and then they do, and nothing. They see that too. You see it, I guarantee you they see it too. These aren't right versus left issues. These are American issues, and it's time for him to remember who he works for, the American people. And in a democracy, the people rule. So why? Why is President Biden refusing to do all of these things? I can't look inside his mind and speak to his motives. We all have to draw our own conclusions as best we can. I can only tell you that in the 90s, Biden was known in the Senate for taking strong anti-drug stands, which included him advocating in the Senate for shutting the border in order to accomplish strong anti-drug goals. And the drug crisis was much less severe then than it is now. Yet now he advocates for open borders and the decriminalization of drugs. What changed? Peter Schweitzer says the financial ties between the Biden family and China did. The Biden family has received $31 million from Chinese businessmen, according to Peter. And these obscene amounts of money are not just from random Chinese individuals. He continues, these businessmen have direct ties to the fentanyl trade. In 2017, the Bidens received a $5 million interest-free, forgivable loan from a Chinese businessman. This man's business partner was a man who goes by the name White Wolf. White Wolf leads the Chinese criminal gang that set up the Sinaloa cartel in the fentanyl trade, which transformed them into the notorious Kings of Fentanyl gang. Is it a coincidence that there is only 1 degree of separation between the Biden family and the Kings of Fentanyl? Is it a coincidence that Biden is virtually the only one in power who is stubbornly ignoring the fentanyl crisis? Is it a coincidence that he is determined to keep the border open? He is trying to claim that he doesn't have the power to close the border without new legislation. That would be the same power that Donald Trump used to close the border, and the same power that he used to reopen it. Draw your own conclusions. I certainly have. Either way, I have enough information to know where I stand on the issues, regardless of whatever I think his personal motives may be. Anyway, I hope you found today's retroactive podcast interesting. And I hope you will come back next week. I truly appreciate all of you, my listeners. Have a good week.